Well, hello, Nativity Bible Heads. It is Dr. Wayne, and it is time for Sunday morning Power Bible Study. We are in the third Sunday after Pentecost, a proper 6 in the year A in our Revised Common Lectionary. Our passages today come from Genesis chapter 18. Our psalm comes from Psalm 116, 116 that is. Our Romans reading, our second lesson is from Romans 5, chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. And then we have another reading from Matthew, chapter 9, verse 35. And the longer reading extends through chapter 10, verse 23. Let's get to it. Genesis, remember, in this track 1 that we are doing during the summer season, during this season of after Pentecost. It really isn't a season. Remember, it's sometimes referred to as ordinary time. This is also what they call in the liturgical world the time after the Epiphany is ordinary time as well. And I don't have time to go into why it's called ordinary, but it doesn't really mean the same thing that we mean when we call something ordinary. It has more to do with numbers, like ordinal numbers versus cardinal numbers, that kind of a thing. Anyway, let's get back to it. Genesis chapter 18. So last week, we started the cycle of stories that Genesis has with regard to God's dealing with Abram, right? And his name was Abram last week. It's now Abraham this week. We don't get that story in our lectionary about the name change, but that's fine. It's not that big of a deal. And Sarai changes to Sarah. Anyway, chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. Remember, I like the way this track has these stories from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, in that it hits the high points. Okay, last week was Abram's got a wife who's barren, and God makes this audacious promise: "I will make of you a great nation." And not only will I make of you a great nation, and you've got a barren wife, but you're going to be a blessing for the whole world, and you're going to be an instrument for me to bless the whole world, and people can bless themselves, and it's just like, oh, there's just so much blessing, you're going to get sick of blessing, so much blessing. Anyway, chapter 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. If you wanted to locate this, this place is south of Jerusalem, south of Bethlehem, a few miles. But one of these days, if you could, I've never taken a Jewish pilgrimage to Israel, but I think you do get to see these sites. Remember, we were told already that Abraham is like heading southward, okay? And so last week he was at Shechem, and then he was at Bethel. Well, now he's even farther south, right? By the oaks of the Mamre, like I said, just south of Bethlehem. And he sat by his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. Random. When you get visitors that you don't know, and we're not told their names, it hints of a divine encounter, okay? When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. Obviously, Abraham had a recognition that this was a divine visitation of some sort, okay? He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." this reveals a lot of insight with regard to Abraham. The divine showings occurred in odd ways in this part of the world, and in a realm. Remember, Abraham was in Canaan, the land of Canaan, and he was in an area of like, he didn't know anybody. He just knew that God had something planned for him. He didn't know how God was going to do it. Remember, we're told that Abraham believed what God had told him about what would happen, but doesn't mean that he knew why or how or whatever. But he had this expectation of divinity in his life based on the promise, okay? So he is offer up hospitality. Hospitality in the realm of the ancient world was that you just simply provided it because it was necessary to be provided. Okay, when we think hospitality, we think coffee and cookies. Well, in this economy and in this day and age that we have in the Bible, it meant giving people a place to stay, offering them a free wash and food. Right. Basic hospitality was totally undeserved. Okay, it was an expression of outpouring of gratitude. It was considered a blessing, okay, to be able to provide that kind of a hospitality. Okay, let us continue. Verse 5, let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. Notice they said. And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it and make cakes. Like she doesn't know how to make bread, right? It's like, why would he have to tell her to knead it? It's like, how else are you gonna make bread, okay? I'm sure Sarah was probably entertained by that. Really? You wanna give me the recipe too? Anyway. Make quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes. Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant. This is, when you're doing this, that means you are preparing a feast for a king. And I don't know how long it takes to butcher a calf person. I don't know. That's a beast that they're going to eat. I'm presuming it takes a little while, but maybe you can get it done quickly. I don't know. He says he hastened to. Then he took a calf, tender, and he gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Yeah, just chop it up and put it on the grill, baby. Verse 8. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. Interesting that you have curds and milk and the meat, because later on there are kosher laws that are very specific that you do not mix the meat and the milk. That's the reason why for extremely observant Jewish people, they will never eat cheeseburgers. I used to work when I was a doctoral student. I worked at a pawn shop for a Jewish man who loved me and just loved having me work for him, and I liked working for him as well. But he was very observant about this, like, oh, can't mix the meat and the milk, can't have cheeseburgers, but every once in a while he would like sneak it in. But yeah, so this is odd that it's like he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. Notice he's prepared it for them. It's not like he drew a feast in. This is the way you did hospitality, especially if it was for somebody who you recognize had a divine presence. And this is what this signifies. Note what happens next. They said to him, where is your wife Sarah? So it's obvious that this is a Sarah story from the fact that their interest here is not in Abraham, although Abraham does everything right here. Remember, one of the things that we get with Abraham is an example of somebody who is obedient to the promise. God says something, I'm going to do this for you, and Abraham doesn't argue against it, just is like, okay, well, you said so, so I'm just acting on what you said. I love this. And in the promise of what God has made to Abraham, we know that, there's a major problem. Sarah is barren. That's where we're going to get more of that right now. Okay. Where's your wife Sarah? And he said, there, in the tent. Then one said, no, we don't have to find Trinity in this, but a lot of commentators see the fact that the visitors were 3 in number, that this is a little precursor, not an idea that comes before the idea of like, oh, you know what, maybe this is an early idea of what Trinity might look like. 3, that's a divine number. Okay. What's it say? So then one said, I will surely return to you in due season. That's interesting. It doesn't say we, it says I. And your wife Sarah shall have a son. This is very interesting. Remember, Sarah and Abraham were already told that they're really old. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. This is a circumlocution for saying that she was postmenopausal, okay? So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? She'd given up on this, the idea of being, she'd resolved to being barren, and that's a bad thing. And it's like she's given up even hope of anything good happening, right? By the way, where it says that she laughed, the root of the word laugh is Yitzchak, okay? Isaac, okay? Which is, spoiler alert, coming up. After verse 13, the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Notice, this is the first time we get the word Lord. Yeah, Lord, all caps. This is the covenant name for God. Covenant name for God doesn't even get revealed until later on with Moses and Sinai after the Exodus, right? But remember, we are getting these stories from a specific strand of writing in the Hebrew Bible called the Yahwist. And the Yahwist tends to use the name Yahweh for God even before that name is revealed, okay? And that's why we get that. The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? I think we know this is a rhetorical question, and it's really about, the fact that this is one of those outlandish promises of God that are going to be real. And here is the teaching that comes from this divine personage. Remember, we're told it was 3 men. Now we're getting the Lord, okay? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? In other words, is there anything God can't do? Is there anything I can't do? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. Whew. That's heavy. That's heavy stuff, right? When you consider the arc of the story that has gone from she was barren to now this, wow. Verse 15, but Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, oh yes, you did laugh. So it almost looks like we have a dialogue here between Sarah and the Lord. I mean, this isn't, we're not told that when it says he said, is this a dialogue with Abraham, or is this a dialogue with the Lord? It sounds to me like it's a dialogue with the Lord, and the Lord, she's like, I didn't laugh, for she was afraid. He said, oh yes, you did laugh. This isn't the end of our reading, but we do have to skip over to something. But compare her reaction to what we get in the New Testament with Mary, and she has this visitation of an angel, and her response is, I am but a handservant to the Lord, do with me as you will. Her response is more out of a sense of trust and faith and obedience, like Abram's response, than it is Sarah's, right? So the story gets concluded. We fast forward to chapter 21, verses 1 to 7. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son whom Sarah bore him. And Isaac, that's the Yitzchak, okay? Same root as the word laughter, okay? Very symbolic, because it's kind of ironic in the way she responded to what God said God would do, right? And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. This sign of circumcision, I don't have time to go into it right now, but it became a thing of a mark of carrying on the covenant, of recognizing the promise of God, of the grace of God. It's kind of like what baptism has become now for us, which is that rite of initiation, which is that rite of doing something that's scary, that puts the promise in jeopardy. Think about this. Circumcision is done on a part of the male anatomy that if you don't do it right, you are putting in danger the whole promise of God that you're going to be the father of many nations, right? Exactly. So circumcision becomes an expression of faith in God, despite the fact that we're putting the human means for that transmission in jeopardy. Think about infant baptism. Pouring the water, the chaos. The water represents chaos. The water can represent that thing which can totally subsume us and take us down. We all know it's possible to drown in water, right? Well, that sense of danger, that sense of putting at risk the promise of the future, and it becomes an expression of God's grace. It's like we are so confident in God that we're willing to go there, and that's my little teaching on the correlation of circumcision and baptism and what it can represent. Now, Abraham circumcised his son when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. Verse 5, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. This obviously is meant to really help us get the point that, wow, he really was old. And when Paul describes him as Paul says that Abraham was as good as dead. It's like, oh yeah, I guess he was. Verse 6, now Sarah said, God has brought laughter, Yitzchak, okay, remember, Isaac, for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. So her laugh of disbelief now becomes a laugh of joy for everyone else. It's a part of that irony that we get in Scripture. Verse 7, last verse. And she said, who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yeah, this is the way they expressed those things back then, right? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Like, it was considered to be almost like cursed if you went through life as a woman in that society and you never bore children. So this is just like a big burden off of her being, okay? All right, we're going to move on. Now, the psalm is designed to be a response to what we read in the first reading. And Psalm 116 is a psalm of thanksgiving. And it sounds a bit like the way that Sarah would respond to this kind of a promise that gets fulfilled. Notice in verse 1 and then of Psalm 116, and then we skip to the end, the last 8 verses. I love the Lord because he has heard the voice of my supplication, because he has inclined his ear to me whenever I called upon him. By the way, the word, when we see the word love, translated as love in our Hebrew Bible, it's kind of like, whereas hate doesn't really mean hate. Hate means not to prefer or not to be chosen. Well, love means the opposite of that, which means to prefer or to choose, okay? It doesn't mean like sentimental, like, oh, my heart is so warm, that kind of, that's not the sense that we get from the Hebrew word that gets translated as love, okay, here. Don't confuse it with covenant love, chesed, which is solidarity. This is love in the sense of like preference or choosing, okay? Yeah. It's like in prayers of thanksgiving, what you do is you justify why it is that your God is your God, and that's what she's doing. How shall I repay the Lord for all the good things he has done for me? I skipped to verse 10 there. I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. Notice all of this, L-O-R-D, all Yahweh, 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 all the way through. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his servants. Ooh, all of a sudden it got dark there, right? Well, what's that about? Well, maybe this is a looking forward to the fact that Jesus died. This is a lot of times in our Psalms we get a big realm of a big swing of human emotion. O Lord, verse 14, I am your servant. I am your servant and the child of your handmaid. You have freed me from my bonds. Remember, her barrenness was considered to be a bond. Does this not sound a little bit like a reaction that we got from Mary, where it says, I'm your child and the servant of your handmaid? Yeah, okay. I'm the servant and the child of your handmaid. I will offer you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and call upon the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the Lord's house, in the midst of you, O Jerusalem. Hallelujah. Now, it's very obvious that this psalm was written in a time when the temple was active and they could actually go to the temple and make these kinds of sacrifices that she's talking about. So it doesn't really set it in the physical setting of Sarah. But if you can imagine this, it is that kind of sentiment. But obviously, this is written in a time when there was a temple. Okay? All right. We're going to move on. Second lesson, Romans chapter 5. Yeah, in Romans, remember what we're getting here is Paul is writing to a congregation in Rome. He himself didn't establish this congregation. This is something that somebody else did, but he is writing to them to try and put to rest a problem in the church with regard to the Gentiles and the Jewish believers. Remember, there was an expelling of the Jews by the Roman emperor prior to the church getting there, and then they come back, and there's Paul is trying to provide a rationale, a theological treatise, if you will, to get the Gentiles and the Jews to see that they are a part of the same fabric, right? And so chapter 5, interesting, just during Lent, the third Sunday of Lent, not that for long ago, we had this same passage and it extended through verse 11. Now we just have the first 8 verses. So it's a very theologically rich section of the book of Romans. Therefore, Since we are justified by faith, last week the passage was from chapter 4, and Paul held up Abraham as the example of this is what it looks like to act out of faith, is to just trust God despite what the circumstances are, okay? Therefore, since we are justified by faith, you gotta remember, but also these chapter divisions, they came like a millennia after the thing was written or slash produced. So they're arbitrary, and so that's sometimes we treat the chapters and verses as somehow divinely inspired. No, they're not. They are just something that got put in for ease of use, and sometimes they match thought units, and sometimes, most of the time, they don't. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. The idea of having peace with God. In the ancient world, the gods were always seen as, the gods are angry. The gods are, we must do something to placate the gods. We must appease the gods, right? Well, Paul is introducing this idea that God has done something really radically, that's unseen in the ancient world, which is God making the move to make peace with us. Yeah. We have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. See, Paul is really pointing to the fact that you have no idea what kind of a God this is, in that gods didn't, back then, they didn't seek out humans. The gods back then were distant and far away, and things had to be done to get the gods to pay attention so that you would get the gods to do what you want for them. And Paul is introducing this radical idea. Here's this God who has done something for us to draw us to him. Our God has made the sacrifice. We're not the one making the sacrifice. God made the sacrifice because God wanted us to be with him, okay? Yeah. Through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. Radical. 3. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings. Yeah. Remember, the idea here is God used this tragedy, this death, this suffering of Jesus as an act by which we are granted forgiveness, right? And so consequently, if Jesus was suffered, and if God could use sufferings to bring us to him, shouldn't we boast in our sufferings? Because sufferings all of a sudden have a new meaning, right? Knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. This is what the Christian faith offered to the world that was so novel. The idea that there's actually hope. There's a reason to have joy in your heart. There's a reason why life doesn't have to be hard and meaningless, and we don't have anything to look forward to. And hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. I hope you see how, in the wake of the outpouring of the Spirit on Pentecost, this how Paul can say something like this, right? Hope does not disappoint, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. Radical way of thinking back in that day. Verses 6, 7, and 8. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person someone might actually dare to die. But God proves his love for us. Love, the idea of God loving people, that was radical in that day. There weren't gods that were like, oh, we got these loving God. No, the gods were bastards. They were mean. They were like, and if you didn't do things right, you would get punished. And so the idea that God's love is so active that it's reaching and scratching and trying to get to us and help us to experience it, radical. This is why Christianity would thrive, is because it offered a way of being in the world. It offered an experience of the world that was foreign to most people. But God proves his love for us, his love, in that while we still were sinners, Christ died for us. God put up the sacrifice. God used our own violence that we think solves problems. God used it to solve a different problem. How do you like that? Just a radical way of looking at it. Theologically rich Romans is. We're moving on. We're going to the gospel passage. Our gospel passage is Matthew chapter 9. And this reading that we have today is split into, there's a shorter version and there are longer. I think I'll probably do the longer simply because that's just how I roll. But it's going to start in chapter 9, verse 35. In my Bible, there's a big gap there because it represents a departure. Remember, there are some scholars propose there's a structure in Matthew of 5 teaching discourses of Jesus, and this is something that some people concentrate on and other people don't. But it's a way of making sense of what Matthew is. I don't need to go into that much more here, but let's just get into the reading. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues. So remember last week's reading, Jesus called Matthew to be one of his followers. And Matthew responded. Matthew said, yeah, sure. Remember, he was a tax collector. Tax collectors were considered to be the scourge of the earth because they were, as Jewish people, they were working for this foreign government, which made them technically, ritually unclean and just a scourge, okay? So here we have, we haven't seen any other disciples, just Matthew, and that's the reason why, this is the reason why we think this is called Matthew. We don't really know if it hailed from a man called Matthew or the man called Matthew in the story. So much it could very possibly just be a tradition that because that's the first thing person that was mentioned that's of one of his followers. So yeah, sure, why not? Let's call it Matthew. Although he had met Simon earlier. But here we go. Verse 6. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. This is a basic statement of what Christ was about, right? When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. This is very much like the kind of God that we have expressed in Paul's letter to the Romans, and also, if you think about it, in the reading of Abraham, of God loving, God, Jesus is acting as God, remember? And to say that he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. This is an expression of his acting as this loving God. And remember, one of the things that Jesus was about was changing the perception of the way of God, okay? the thing about where it says like sheep without a shepherd, we got to keep in mind whenever we see shepherd imagery in the New Testament, Old Testament as well, that was a big metaphor for king and what the king was supposed to be. King David, remember, the ideal shepherd, the shepherd king, right? And we as a sheep, Jesus talking about himself as the shepherd and all of that. So we're familiar with that, right? Well, shepherd meant a little bit more than that for ancient Israel because of the fact that the king was seen to be like the ideal shepherd. That was the intention anyway. Frequently they failed, but that was always the idea that was supposed to be behind them. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." This is going to be, we're going to get a little, a segment here that is kind of time bound because it's going to be dealing with and illustrate the movement of the church from where it started to where it went eventually. We got to remember, at the end of Matthew, we had this with our text for, what was it? I think it was Trinity Sunday. Where we had the Great Commission, which was the last 3 or 4 verses of the Gospel of Matthew, which was, "Go therefore into" where? All the world, making disciples of all nations, right? That's where Matthew's headed, but that's not where Matthew starts. Listen, verse 10, or chapter 10, verse 1. Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples. It's probable that Jesus had the 12 as a way of copying the symbolic nature of that number of the tribes of Israel. Very, very possible that was Jesus' choice. Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. Basically, it's saying everything that Jesus was doing, he gave them the same authority to do the same exact thing. Yeah. These are the names of the 12 apostles. Notice they're called apostles in this list. They weren't called that in the previous verse. They were called disciples. Apostles mean people, the sent ones, the ones who are being sent, from the Greek verb apostello, to send. And so usually we see this mostly in the post-resurrection kind of narratives, because it's not until they have been sent out to do something that they are actually considered apostles. So this is, so it could equally be translated, these are the names of the 12 sent ones. It could be, but they didn't know. It's like, oh, how are we going to translate this word? Well, let's just go with the word in Greek is apostellos. So how about just apostles? Yeah, that's how that happens. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Notice this isn't exactly the same list that we had in, I think it was in John, was it? Where we have, and the names are a little bit different. I don't have time to go into all of that, but it is interesting that we don't have the exact same list. We don't ever see 2 lists exactly the same with the exact same names. Matthew's gospel, though, is the only gospel that mentions the name Matthew. In all the other gospels, there's the name Levi. Yeah. And it's strongly believed that was, people back then, they had it wasn't unusual for them to have 2 names, a name in Greek and a name in Hebrew. And that's what we get with the name Thaddeus. Thaddeus is can sometimes be rendered as Judas. Remember, there were 2 Judases. There was Judas Iscariot and Judas, son of James. So, a lot of people think that, this is that person, that Judas. But we don't get that. We don't get we don't just get the same exact number or exact same names in any of the lists that we find in the New Testament. These 12, Jesus sent out with the following instructions. So this is where we get the word sent. They were the sent ones, and this is Jesus sent them, okay? He apostled them, okay? With the following instructions: go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is it kind of strikes us a little funny because of, like, we know where the Matthew story goes with regard to the Great Commission, but we got to keep in mind that Matthew could be trying to show how the ministry of the church started out and then it expanded. Remember, even in the Great Commission, it mentions, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the whole world. So the idea was always like to go out, but the idea of starting here, starting in the center of the circle, it's a starting point. That's what the point is here, that during Jesus' day, that was the starting point. Why? Because you want to get a base, you want to build up a base for you to build upon. And the idea here is we need to get as many people on board of the Jewish faith, because that's what God is doing. God is using the Jewish. One of the things we want to keep in mind is that when Jesus was alive, remember, he was Jewish. His original followers were Jewish. This was a starting point. You got to build up the base before you can move out. We wanted to get them on board. So when he talks about go only to, this doesn't mean that they don't like the Gentiles or they don't like the Samaritans. It just means this is the starting point during the earthly ministry of Jesus, because we know that it's going to go outward from there, but it's got to start with this. We want to get the base as strong as we can before we do that, okay? So go into no town, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons, and receive without payment. Give. You received without payment, now give without payment. Kind of a little bit of instruction in here, if you think about it, for the early church as well. You know what? I'm not going to go any farther. Oh yeah, I will. We're going to finish this to the end of verse 23. Give without payment. So notice the next instruction. Take no gold or copper or silver or copper. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts. No bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. Yeah, this is a little bit of instruction for people in the church. The idea, there's this ideal way of being that symbolizes our dependence on what God is doing, and to keep things simple for us as we be that witness, right? Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, and stay there until you leave. Okay. The idea is don't be shopping around. Just find something acceptable and deal with that. Don't let your conveniences or your lack of them be that thing that keeps you from the task at hand, okay? As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. Yeah, again, the idea is don't get caught up in how you feel about things. Keep your focus on the task at hand, okay? If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. A lot of people say, you know, that's a curse or whatever, but it's a symbolic way of saying, I'm not taking it. Whatever you put on me, I'm leaving it here. Because I can't afford that experience in life. I've got so much good to do for God. I can't afford to let that get clouded by what you just put on me. This is what we should see this as. Truly I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. This is just another way of saying, well, shame on them. You just don't worry about it. You just keep on doing what you know you're supposed to be doing. See, I'm sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of them, for they will hand you over to councils and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them and the Gentiles. When they hand you over, do not worry about how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given you at that time. There came a time when there was a need for them to account for themselves in the times of persecution that happened during this time of witness shortly after Jesus physically disappeared. This is his way of giving them that instruction so they'll see that he anticipated this happenstance, right? For what you are to say will be, for it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. Matthew's gospel concentrates a lot on how God used the Jewish world for the good of the whole world. And yes, there did come a time when Jews who chose Jesus as the Messiah paid a price with regard to their family and with regard to their friends and stuff. And this is Matthew's way of saying, Jesus knew this was going to happen, so don't be surprised. This doesn't make it pleasant, but it's going to happen. And you will be hated by all because of my name, by the one who endures, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I tell you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Okay, the teaching is in a sending out thing. We don't get a whole lot of a report of what actually happens, but the instruction is what Matthew is wanting us to key on, because in the way our gospel writers write, sometimes they are writing with a view toward the future and what the situation is going to be, and couching it in words as spoken by Jesus himself makes more of an impact. So that's what we have in here. So I hope that we see that in the wake of our Pentecost experience and and our realization of the Trinity, that now what we're getting in our scripture things are like the way of being in the world, accepting by faith the promise of God with no evidence. There's no evidence that it can be fulfilled. Abraham didn't have any evidence that the promise made to him was going to be fulfilled. And here the disciples, they don't have any evidence that of what their promise is being fulfilled. Jesus is just preparing them for the way things are going to be. This is a lesson for us in the way we live our lives with regard to the gospel today. That is it for today. Until next time, peace.